Hi everybody, this is Mr. Nolan, and I just kind of want to get you caught up to speed with what we've been doing this week. We have been looking at some new interesting model organisms in order to study populations changing. And so we want to talk a little bit about that. And in particular, one of those model organisms that we're going to be looking at is a special kind of bird called Juncos. So we're going to talk about Juncos as a study subject, what's good about it, what's not good about it, and also what are some things that we can start to pick out right away that we might be able to learn about changing populations by watching Juncos. So during the screencast, I am going to ask you to pause a few times and to refer to some documents that are linked to my website, and also have you watch a video that's linked in the information section of this screencast and also is linked on my website. So you might have to pause this a few times and move around in order to really get the fullest out of this screencast. But our main goal today is really to be able to explain the advantages and disadvantages of using Juncos as a study population. That's really sort of our goal here. What's good about them, what's maybe, not so great about them. So what are they, right? Juncos. What are they, and how can we use these to study populations? Well, a junco is a bird, and the juncos that we find in Michigan, we only see them for the winter. It doesn't mean that they only live in places where it's snowy necessarily, but that's just when we find them around here. The juncos that live in Michigan are a subspecies that's kind of drab and kind of plain. They just have this sort of slate-colored or sort of, charcoal-colored upper portion, their head and sort of the, their back and some of their breast is mostly just sort of the slate gray. And they've got kind of a whitish, belly and breast down here. And they have cute little pink legs. So they're cute little birds. They're called dark-eyed juncos is the ones that we have around here. And so you'll find them in the winter. And they generally kind of all look the same. Some of their eyes are actually hard to see because the rest of their feathers are so dark. But we're going to be looking at a subspecies of juncos found in California, which are maybe a little bit more colorful. Their backs are a little bit more brown. Their breasts and sides here are a little bit buffier, and their the slate color only extends down a little bit down into the breast and down to the neck. They've got this pink beak here. So we're going to be looking at these juncos. And what's convenient about birds is that they have a lot of anatomical parts that we can sort of use to categorize things, right? So we know, okay, a tail and, a head and things, but there's also some important markers that some of the scientists in the video that you'll watch in a moment are using in order to actually describe these juncos, certain characteristics of these juncos. So these juncos that we're going to be paying a lot of attention to are on the UCSD campus, and UCSD stands for University of California, San Diego, and this is a couple of hundred acres in San Diego, on the Pacific coast of California, and so this is a population that we're going to look at today and try to decide, is this population worth using to study how populations change over time? So let's kind of talk a little bit about that, but before we go any further, I have a video that I'd like you to watch if you haven't already. It's on Vimeo, and I want you to watch it until about 8 minutes and 7 seconds, or sometime around then, pretty close to about 8 minutes. This video is also linked in the information section of this video, but here it is right there. So before you go any further, I want you to watch up to the first about 8 minutes, and at the back of your mind, I want you to kind of be asking yourself, are these birds good to use as study subjects or not if we're trying to figure out how a population changes over time? So I want you to go ahead and please pause the video if you haven't seen this Vimeo shot video yet, and go ahead and watch that for the first 8 minutes. Alright, so now that you've watched that video for the first 8 minutes, certain things are bound to have struck you. We have these two populations of juncos. We've got the mountain juncos who, the researchers are sort of focusing on Mount Laguna, which is east of San Diego, and we noticed some things about that environment, which we'll get into more in the next screencast. But we've really got these two populations. There's a really big one that extends out to Mount Laguna, and there's a tiny little population that lives on this campus. and in this area, right, on this campus and in this area. And this is really convenient because, you know, at a university campus, you have grad students and university professors and researchers who are able to kind of watch this population as it interacts with its environment. And what they're starting to notice is that there are actually some differences between the Juncos that live on campus all year round and the Juncos that live in the mountains. And those mountain Juncos migrate. So there's a small group of birds, population of birds on the UCSD campus that stay there all year round, and they breed like crazy. And the Mount Laguna birds really don't do that. There's a little bit of mixing between these populations. Sometimes Mount Laguna birds will become part of this UCSD campus, and maybe sometimes the UCSD campus birds will leave and will switch places with the Mount Laguna birds. But we see these two distinct populations. So at this point, I want you to dive in a little bit further and start to learn a little bit more about what are things that distinguish these different locations, what are things that distinguish the birds, what makes them good or maybe not so good study subjects. And the way that you're going to do this is by reading an article by Pamela Yeh. Now, Pamela Yeh is a grad student who works, or at least did work, at the UCSD campus, collecting lots of information about this Junco population. And she wrote this article. It's just kind of a summary of some of the work that she and some other grad students have been doing with these birds. Now the birds, remember, they showed up on campus in 1983, so they've been there for more than 100 generations. There's been many, many, many Juncos that have lived and died since they were first discovered in 1983. And so Pamela Yeh has been studying them along with other researchers. And so this is her paper. I don't know if I will be able to link it to the information portion of the video at the bottom, but you can at least go to my website here, and it's included on my website. It's called Junco article by Pamela Yeh. And so I want you to go find that. I want you to read it. Again, as you read, I want you to think, well, what are some methods that they're using, and what are some things that makes this a good population to study or a challenging population to study. So please go find that article if you haven't already, and read through that and note what's good, what's challenging about using these birds as a research subject. All right, so now that you've found the student activity sheets, I want you to find page 62. It looks like this. And on page 62, you'll find some of these data sources. So we just read about the Juncos in Pamela Yeh's little sort of shortened article. And we're going to kind of start comparing some data. Some of this they talked about in the video, like the breeding season, how we found that Mount Laguna's birds only breed for 2 months out of the year, but UCSD birds breed for like 7. So this sort of thing, I want you to go ahead and find this, page 62. And, you know, I want us to consider some questions. So you've got these data sources that are really 3 different sources of data. We've got one that's sort of written here that talks about what some of the researchers have found out. We've got this breeding season one. We also have some population information about how the size of their population has changed since the late 1990s. So these are the kinds of questions that you're going to want to consider, and I want you to respond to these if you haven't already. I want you to actually respond to them in your student sheet. What information can we pull from these diagrams? You know, especially B and C. Would this be helpful in figuring out how these populations interact with their environments? Why or why not? You know, so especially B and C, what can we figure out from that, and is it helpful? Does the information in data source A reflect or conflict with the information in B and C? There's some, you know, there's a sort of an argument for or against that. So I want you to look at those and think, does that really conflict, or is it saying the same thing? What might be a cause for some of the differences that we see in reproduction between the populations? We see that there are breeding season differences, number of broods that they can have. What could be some differences based on what you know about the UCSD campus and the Laguna Mountains? And lastly, I want you to kind of, you know, come up with a little argument for yourself. Are Juncos a good or poor research organism for studying populations or not? So these are the questions that I want you to kind of think through based on the article, based on the video, and also based on this information on page 62 of the student activity sheets. So in our next video, what I'm going to do, what we'll do, is we will talk about some of the differences that we notice between the Mount Laguna environment and the UCSD environment, in particular their climate differences and also some differences on the ground, which we're going to see with Google Street View. So go ahead and check out that video after you have responded to these questions and done some thinking about these birds and these environments.